to the third in our series of Let's Talk 2020 Census. Today's session is Let's Talk 2020 Census, Counting North Carolina's Kids. And as we lead into the session, I especially want to give a big thank you to the State Library of North Carolina for hosting these sessions. I hope you'll join us for sessions as we move forward every week into August, discussing more facets of the 2020 census in our state. Now, the U.S. Census happens once every 10 years. And while the goal is very simple, to count everyone once, only once, and in the right place, the process can be a little complicated and confusing. To help us to understand the process for counting children of all ages, we're lucky to have Whitney Tucker of NC Child with us today. We want to thank Whitney for your time and expertise, especially since Whitney is recovering from COVID. So Whitney, thank you for being a hero and being with us today.
Thank you guys for having me. I'm excited.
Today's question and answer is being recorded, and this session with supporting resources will be posted on the State Library's YouTube channel. The Q&A session is just that. So if you have a question, please use the chat feature. This is located near the bottom center of your screen. Click on chat and you'll be able to type your question in the window that pops up. Please feel free to ask any questions you have. Now I'd like to introduce Whitney Tucker. Excuse me. Whitney is the policy director at NC Child, where she leads the agency's legislative advocacy effort and uses data and research to analyze how public policy can better support children and families. Whitney collaborates on strategy with external partners and serves as NC Child's point person for lawmakers and the media. She was appointed to the North Carolina Complete Count Commission in 2018 and is chair of the Education and Youth Committee. Whitney holds an MPH from the University of South Carolina and a BA in Public Policy from Vanderbilt University. Whitney will begin with an initial summary of census information for children and then some initial questions to get the conversation started. Please feel free to enter your questions in the chat at any time. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Whitney Tucker.
Thank you, Bob. All right, I'm gonna switch over and start sharing a presentation with you guys. As Bob said, I'm just going to give a quick summary of this topic, and there's really a lot that can be said even in this short period of time that we have together. So I'm gonna run through a lot of information pretty quickly, but please, again, put your questions in the chat box, and we can also circle back to anything that I cover that you might want to dive into a little bit deeper. So let's get started. First, just quickly about NC Child, so you understand why I'm the one speaking to you on this issue. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy advocacy organization, and we work to advocate for policies that really ensure that all children have opportunities for success. The census rose up out of any number of priorities that we could set, because it really ties together all of the things that children and families need into one single, really easily digestible policy issue. I'm gonna talk a little bit more about how that works and why that is, but just so that you know, basically every service that you think of as being really integral to children's success in our society goes back to census funding and also representation of communities based on our census count. And so it's really important that everyone be included in that count. So generally overall, this slide is just telling you why the census matters, right? The US Census is mandated in Article 1, Section 2 of our Constitution to count all residents of the United States. And then this count is used to determine apportionment of US congressional seats for states, and also to allocate billions and billions of dollars in federal funding. It also at the local level helps us to determine where community needs are highest and what exactly those needs are. So where we should put grocery stores, where we need to fix roads and bridges and that sort of thing to make things more accessible for folks. All of that is information that's gleaned from the count that comes through the census. It's our only good shot in our country to get a head count of who all is here, right? So unlike really large scale surveys that we do, this is not an estimate, this is a true count that we're trying to get together. And so it's really important that everyone be included, no matter their age. Now, that being said, years of underfunding have really significantly altered the Census Bureau's preparation and plans for the current census. Numerous elements have been paused or scaled back or eliminated, and the Census Bureau was mandated to conduct the 2020 census at a lower cost per household this year than in 2010. That caused all of those different changes to need to be made to try and cut costs and still hit deadlines. And rural communities have been hit especially hard. There were also plans for a dress rehearsal in 3 really diverse sites that were replaced by a single end-to-end test in an urban site. There have been restrictions on who can be hired as enumerators, with citizenship really being like a sticking point there. Lots of different considerations that the Census Bureau has had to make in trying to ensure that we can count everyone and keep costs low. One of the biggest changes has been that this year's census allows the option to respond online, which has turned out to really be a blessing because of COVID-19, right? With so many people now having to stay indoors, this census is easier than ever to fill out because all you have to do is log in online. The timeline for the census has been pushed back this year to allow more time for folks to get in their information. And I've included a chart here on the slide so that you understand what the Census Bureau is planning in terms of next steps. The self-response phase, which is when people are answering online, by phone, by mail, that phase was originally scheduled to end July 31st and now won't be ending until October 31st. So if you haven't filled out your census yet, you still have time, and you should do it immediately. But all of that said, these things are all happening, all of those changes to the timeline to try and, save money and make the census more efficient. All of that was happening before COVID-19 hit. And then the new operations schedule had to be developed. And it's all just even more complicated when you look specifically at North Carolina and our rapidly changing demographics as a state. The total population in North Carolina is just about 10.4 million and 64% white. Now, for comparison, the child population in our state is just over 2.4 million and only 54% white. This is going to be relevant in a second when we talk about hard to count communities. So we know that this census is really going to be the first where North Carolina can really capture the magnitude of our state's really recent population growth, particularly among young Latino children. So of all the children in our state, fully 1/4, over 600,000 of them, are under age 5. And in terms of population trends, the fastest growing population in the state is Hispanic and Latino children born to North Carolina resident parents or to US-born parents who migrated to North Carolina from other states. From 2010 to 2016, the US Census Bureau estimates that North Carolina's Hispanic population grew by 132,000 new residents, which represented a 16.5% increase. This is really relevant when we're talking about recent population growth because children under age 5 and Hispanic or Latino children accounted for 2 of the top 3 populations with the highest net undercount rates in our previous census, which I'm going to dig into a little bit more on the next slide. So if North Carolina is going to receive its due share of congressional representation and financial resources from the federal government, we will really need to ramp up our efforts to reach the families of young children, and particularly the families of young Hispanic and Latino children this year, so that our state can really be well represented. Now, young child residents were the nation's most undercounted in 2010. So this isn't a problem that was only affecting North Carolina, but it is a problem that we have really struggled with. Young children had a higher net undercount rate in the 2010 census by far than any other demographic group. Since 1980, the net undercount of young children in the census has worsened, while coverage of older children and adults has improved. And you can see that here on this chart. Even when we're looking outside of just demographic groups, when it comes to race or age, when you start looking at things like people who own versus people who rent, young children are being undercounted across all of those groups. And then when you dig a little bit deeper into the data specifically for kids under the age of 5, we see that among young children, Black and Hispanic children are undercounted at a much higher rate. So this is really worth noting in light of our state's population trends. Hispanic children are the least likely to be counted among young children, followed closely by a high undercount of Black children. It's estimated that more than 25,000 young children in North Carolina were missed in our 2010 census. Independent researchers believe that if those children had been counted, not even taking into account all of the adults that were missed for different reasons in the last census as well, but if just those children had been counted, our state would have already received an additional seat in Congress. So a quick update on how we're doing this year, what things are looking like so far. So I've talked about the fact that young children are less likely to be counted in the census, and I'm going to explain why that is. But you see that already starting to happen in our state. We're starting to show some of those trends from previous censuses that we've really been working hard to push back against with our efforts to reach different communities. So first off, the census response rate in North Carolina is 58%. We now rank 34th out of 50 states in DC. 32 counties still have fewer than half of households responding to the census, and the majority of these are in the rural west and northeast of the state, where we know that there are a lot of different reasons. Families might not have responded to their census yet, certainly in light of COVID, but broadband internet access also being something that families are really struggling with, and a reason that we might be seeing these higher or these lower response rates in more rural areas. We also see that census tracts with the most young children are already lagging behind the state, with a response rate that's nearly 2% below the state average. And then tracts where the majority of residents identify as minority race or ethnicity have a response rate that is nearly 7% below the state average. So why are we missing young kids? North Carolina's young children disproportionately live in areas with characteristics that make them difficult for the U.S. Census Bureau to count. So in the chart here, you can see the percent of each age group, 0 through 4, and then 10 through 17 for comparison, that live in the conditions that are listed on the left. This is showing that previous census responses have shown that children of color, children in low-income households, children in immigrant families are all at really high risk of being undercounted. And in our state, those children are also very likely to be under the age of 5. This is important because that means that in North Carolina, the children who are most likely to be undercounted are also those who stand to suffer the most from reductions in funding to really vital children's programs that result from a census undercount. Also, I want to clarify one thing on this slide. You see the term complex families. This is a reference to families where the household structure is a little less traditional. So maybe not, mother, father, children in the household, maybe a grandmother who has her son and his daughter living with her. And so she might be the householder who receives the census form or the response reminder, and she doesn't include her granddaughter because it's not her child, although the granddaughter and her son are actually living in that same household. And so what we really want is for everyone to have the information that they need to understand that everyone in that household should be counted, even if the householder isn't, the parent of a young child that's in that house, and even if the people in that household weren't actually related. We see this a lot with families that might work in, farming or transient working environments. So we might see, one or more families living under the same roof, or unrelated adults who live together with, a few small children who, may or may not get counted depending on who in that household happened to pick up the census form, right? And so we really want to be able to remind folks that everyone in your household counts, even if they are not your family member, and no matter how old they are. So to my point about children's programs being underfunded when we don't count kids in the census, I'll say that an undercount of young children in particular equates to really huge reductions in federal funding for more general needs statewide, like Medicare Part B payments and highway planning and construction. But you can see here in this chart the implications of an undercount for young children. And this data is based on fiscal year 2015 spending just for child-only programs in our state. In 2000, we know that North Carolina had an undercount of children in the census, and as a result, eligible kids were put on a waiting list for the state's CHIP program until additional funds could be secured. We don't want to see something like that happen again. This under-resourcing for public programs is the consequence of undercounting kids, along with really devastating losses to data accuracy. Right, so not only will we have less funding for Head Start and Early Head Start, but we'll have data that makes it difficult for us to understand where those services are really needed for families, right? And so we might have really high need in areas that weren't counted and then are under-resourced as a result, which sort of creates a cycle, where parents might not, understand what the point is of filling out the census because they aren't getting these public supports, but they're not getting the public supports because the census isn't being filled out year after year. So when we get to 100% count, that makes it a lot easier for community service providers to ensure that we are designing and supporting interventions in ways that really meet the needs of our state's kids and families. So in my work to try and promote this issue and remind families to fill out the census and help folks to reach families, a few different concerns have come up again and again. Right? And so I've thrown in this slide to give you sort of a cheat sheet of the things that people tend to worry about the most in my experience and just the actual facts behind those concerns. So number one, the census form does not ask residents about citizenship status. As you saw in an earlier slide, the census has been, being collected in this in the country, since January in the most remote places, and that's not a question that's on the current census form. And I know that there was a lot of news about a potential citizenship question being added in the past, and that was defeated in the courts. And now there's this new memo from the president regarding citizenship, but there is no citizenship question on this year's census form. And we can talk a little bit more about any concerns folks have about that, through the chat box if you'd like. Secondly, an accurate count covers anyone and everyone living in your household. I touched on this really briefly, but again, this includes non-relatives, distant relatives, folks who are just staying with you temporarily, kids of all ages. Even if a child was born on Census Day, which was April 1st of this year, that child counts, right? If the child is a newborn, we still want to make sure that they are considered a North Carolina resident, because when we don't count extremely young children even, that means that they are going to miss out on the resources that are due to our state over the next 10 years of their lives, right? So they won't get another chance to be counted until they're 10 years old. Third, the U.S. Census Bureau never shares identifiable information, not even with other federal departments and agencies. We have very strong laws against this in our country, and we also don't have evidence of this being a problem since those laws were put into place, right? I understand that there are a lot of really valid reasons that folks might want to keep their information private, but in doing that with the census, it's really going to harm communities more than it will actually provide any personal privacy or safety, really. And then fourth, the census is more than just paperwork. Census data determines about $1.5 trillion in federal funds to states. Again, congressional apportionment, so our representation actually depends on this count. And then local planning, right? We're not going to be able to have, emergency departments that are well placed if we aren't able to determine where everyone lives, how many people live in an area, how old they are. That sort of information might seem a little bit, a little stressful for some people to be giving up to the federal government, right? And I understand that, but that information is how we determine what it is that people need and how we can ensure that people get it. So to my earlier point, when we look at the census as something that is just a paper form that can be discarded, we're really overlooking the fact that it has this huge multiplier effect within the community. And over time, when you don't see those effects, it also becomes something that, that really erodes public trust in the ability of government to meet their needs, right? But that thing is a negative feedback loop, right? So by not filling out the census, you ensure that you're not going to get the resources that your community needs. And then not getting those resources tends to make people feel like there's no point in filling out the census. So, you know, we really have to break that cycle and push forward past that fear. So, I also want to note that while the net undercount of young children is incredibly high, their omission rate is even higher, 10.3% compared to that 4.6% that you saw in the earlier slides. So that means that not only are many young children, primarily those in hard to count communities, living in families that are not submitting their census forms, but even more are being left off of forms in families that do return them with information about other household members. So an estimated 80 to 85% of young children missed in the 2010 census nationally were in families that did return a questionnaire. This is really important to know from a messaging standpoint, because we have to say the census is convenient, it's safe, it's required, and both return your census questionnaire and make sure everyone in your household is included, even the itty bitty babies, right? Focus group testing of effective messages and messengers for families of different racial and ethnic backgrounds has been conducted by 5 different national organizations, including the US Census Bureau. And for those resistant to completing the form, it's been found that across all races and ethnicities and age groups, that funding for public services was rated as the #1 most important reason to respond to the census. That resonates with a lot of different people. And so as you were trying to encourage families to fill out their forms and to include young children, you know, really play up the importance of this single, simple act to funding for public services that is going to stretch out over the next decade. So to help you do that, NC Child has created some resources to reach more families of young children. The video that you see here is one of our update videos that you'll see at the site listed here, ncchild.org/census. Those can be easily shared on social media. I've also listed some of the other things that we have, including fact sheets. We also have a report that we produced with the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials on the specific impact of a young Latino undercount. You can also find that on our website, but you know, things that you can share on social media, things that you can present at, you know, volunteer groups that you might be a part of. And also we have an early childhood curriculum, which is really important because early childhood providers have been consistently ranked as a very highly influential group to receive census information from in national focus group research. We know that parents really listen to them, as well as pediatricians, other healthcare providers. And when you are promoting the census, that's what you want to think about. If we're talking about, you know, really addressing the undercount of young kids, where is it that young families really end up often, right? So doctor's offices, childcare providers, grocery stores, those are the places that we really want to be promoting. So the US Census Bureau has also really released a treasure trove of materials back in December, ranging from posters to sing-along songs that you can do with kids, to infographics that you can share online. And you can find all of those at the website listed here, 2020census.gov. If you look under the Partners tab and then Outreach Materials, you can just take your pick and hopefully really promote some local partnerships to get more posters and information about the census up in your, you know, local grocery stores, to have, you know, things that you can post on your doors for people who might, you know, pass by, or post out in your yard for folks who might drive by. And then also lots of stuff that you can share online, since we know, you know, everybody is at home now, right? They got a much higher chance of seeing those things when you post them. So that is my, you know, general overview. And now we should have lots of time for questions.
Whitney, that's great. You gave us a lot of fantastic information, a lot of good data on what's going on with the younger community, the child community in North Carolina. We do have some questions, though. First of all, how is COVID safety being handled with the census?
Sure. So the Census Bureau is actually very safe in terms of how they're going about reaching out to households for the places that have not responded online or by phone. But the first line of defense against COVID is to encourage families to respond on their own without anyone needing to come to their home. And so by doing that, they're really promoting online response, which is very simple and easy. If you don't have the code that they sent in the mail earlier this year, or in any of those reminder postcards they might have sent, you can just put in your address online and fill out the census that way. It takes less than 5 minutes. Or you can call. And then if they do come to your door, the Census Bureau has taken lots of precautions. Census workers will now wear personal protective gear. When they come to your door, it is going to be as little contact as possible, but you can really avoid all of that by just filling out the form, virtually.
That's great. And just to let folks know, in the comments that are going by in the chat window, we have links to be counted. So if you'd like to go online and be counted, it's my2020census.gov. And if you'd rather use your phone, that's an option as well. The phone number for English response is 844-330-2020. And if you'd like to respond by phone in Spanish language, it's 844-468-2020. You can also visit the Census website. There are phone lines in 12 different languages if you'd like to be counted that way. And as Whitney pointed out, the census workers are scheduled to begin the door-to-door non-response follow-up in August 11th. So if you respond now by either phone or internet, it reduces the necessity for a census worker to visit you, and it preserves as much of that social distance as possible. So please be safe, but please be counted. And the sooner you're counted, the less likely you are to be visiting.
Right.
So also, are there specific resources? You mentioned the posters, you mentioned the sing-along songs. Will you be singing along for the kids?
I will not, but hopefully their childcare providers will. So the posters, sing-alongs, we have some postcards that NC Child has been distributing right now at feeding sites, school feeding sites where families are coming to pick up meals. And we also have a childcare provider kit that includes some lesson plans that the Census Bureau put out for kids of different ages, for those families that, do have their kids in care right now, partnering with childcare centers and, asking if they might promote the census so that more families can know about it certainly can't hurt. And you can find all of those at NC Child's website, which I think is listed in the chat box now.
Yes.
Yeah, and then there's also lots of resources available from NALEO for Spanish-speaking families. NC Child has translated a lot of our things into Spanish as well, but at NALEO they also have a hotline. If you have questions or you feel that you have some concerns about the census process and want to talk that through with someone outside of the Bureau for any reason, you could call NALEO's hotline, and I can drop that in the chat as well. They have an entire campaign that is focused just on kids under 5 called Hazme Contar, which has really great resources as well.
That's fantastic. And just so folks will know, NALEO stands for the National Association of Latino Elected Officials. And they've been very active in making sure that all the Spanish-speaking community in North Carolina and around the country are counted in the census. So please visit their resources. And as Whitney pointed out, the U.S. Census Bureau has a Statistics in Schools program, or Stats in Schools. And that program has got lesson plans, worksheet, games, all sorts of online resources that as folks are home right now, parents, if you'd like to have some educational and fun activities for your kids that involve getting to know the census a little bit, those resources are absolutely free. You can download those and use them right now. Also, as Whitney mentioned, we recognize that the digital divide has been an issue in North Carolina. There are some folks that would like to respond to the census online, but they don't have internet access at home. Governor Cooper has appropriated some Wi-Fi hotspots. Those have been distributed to the local school districts, and many of the school districts are putting those on buses. To find out where those public school buses are with Wi-Fi hotspots, you need to contact your local school system. But you can drive up to the bus, access the Wi-Fi, download lesson plans for your child, download information about COVID, but you can also be counted at the same time. And it's important to remember that the census is very quick. So once you do have access, it just takes a few minutes. It's really just 10 questions for every person in your household, regardless of age. So please take advantage of those resources. Another important thing, Whitney, you mentioned the breakdown of the undercount of children for the very young children and also by the race categories. Can you give us a little information about how people define themselves on the census? Is there just a single option for a checkbox, or how do you make sure that you're providing the right information?
Sure. So the Census Bureau has actually just updated the way that folks fill in their race on this year's census form. Every year they try and get a little bit more specific to make it easier for people to fill out the census in a way that they really identify with. On this year's census form, you'll see a question that asks about each person's race. And on that question, you can mark one or more boxes that have white, Black or African American, American Indian or Alaska Native. There are lots of different Asian identities. And then under each of those boxes, there's also a set of fillable blocks. If you're filling out a paper form or if you're online, you'll just type it in where you can be more specific. So if you were to check white, you can also print or type in Irish, Italian, German, etc. If you were to check American Indian, you could type in, your specific tribe or your specific village, even if that were, something that were relevant for you. And then within your Asian categories, there are lots of different nationalities that you could check in, but then even under that, they leave space for you to fill in anything that is more specific. So you might put in, other Pacific Islander, and you could write in, Tongan, Marshallese, etc. And then there's still some other race category for you to write in anything that doesn't feel accurate, right? And so you can choose several different races. You can also be really specific about exactly your ethnicity so that the Census Bureau understands how you see yourself really well.
I think that's a key point, Whitney. Thanks for mentioning that. The census is not someone else. It's not the federal government or the state government telling you who you are. It's you telling the decision makers, this is how I identify. These are my needs in my community. So whether it's how you identify in terms of gender, how you identify in terms of race or ethnicity, you can check as many race categories as you feel applies to you. And you can be as specific as how you identify. That is completely up to you. I would like to also give folks a reminder that you have the opportunity to enter any questions that you have in the chat feature. So please do that. Whitney, we were just talking about the level of detail, the amount of information folks can provide to the census. Can you give us a little detail? I know there are some folks that have concerns about how confidential, how safe is my data once I give it to the Census Bureau?
Your data is extremely safe once you give it to the census. There's a fine for census workers if they were to reveal any of your data, which there really isn't a precedent for. The Census Bureau also doesn't even share your data outside of the Census Bureau with other federal agencies. And so you don't have to worry if you don't want your information shared with, ICE, the CIA, the FBI, anybody, right? The Census Bureau is just trying to get an accurate count of people who are living in this country so that we can all be represented, right? It is not a political tool. And so it is not something that you have to be worried about. And your data is also kept safe for, I think it's 72 years. 72 years before it can even be released at all for any public viewing, even though this information is, pretty basic stuff. And that's really just for genealogy purposes, right? If folks want to look back and trace their lineage, they still wouldn't be able to do it for another 72 years. So your information is very confidential, and you don't have to be afraid of sharing it with the Census Bureau at all.
Great point. So yeah, the confidentiality guidelines are spelled out by Title 13 of the U.S. Code. So any census worker, anyone who goes door to door, anyone who actually sees the census data, the detailed census data, is sworn to confidentiality for their lifetime. The penalty for violating confidentiality is 5 years in federal prison and or $250,000 fine. And that confidentiality oath is on every census worker's ID badge, which they'll be wearing when they go door to door, even though they will be wearing a mask and they'll be wearing gloves during COVID, they'll still have their ID, so you'll know they're an official census worker. And as Whitney mentioned, your information is confidential. It's not shared with any federal, state agency, not any individual for 72 years. So the latest personal information that's available from the census is from the 1940 census. And the 1950 census data will be released in 2022. So being counted, confidentiality is very serious with the Census Bureau, so you can feel safe about that process. And as Whitney also mentioned, the COVID situation has delayed the timeline. So in terms of when we'll see census data, originally the total state populations, what's known as the apportionment release of the census, was due out December 31st of this year. That would be the release. It's just total state populations, but that determines which states receive how many congressional seats. That release has been proposed to be pushed back until April 1st of next year. Congress would have to approve that, so we're still not sure if that's going to happen. And the following release is the really detailed release, the redistricting release, also known as the Public Law 94-171 release. That was going to be released starting April 1st of next year on a flow basis. The Census Bureau has requested that that be pushed back to July 1st of next year. Again, that's going to have to get congressional approval for that to happen. But when that redistricting release comes out, that's when we'll see the total population for counties, cities, towns, neighborhoods. That's when that information will be released. But again, it's just statistical information. It's not names and addresses. That information is confidential. Let's see. Any questions? I don't see any other questions in the chat. Whitney, are there any points that you'd like to bring up on behalf of NC Child as we begin to wrap things up?
Sure. I would just like to say that if you're looking to do more at the local level to ensure that you have an accurate census count specifically for young kids, partner. If there are parent groups that you're a part of, if there are neighborhood groups that you're a part of, if your child is in care right now, if there are any groups of other parents of young children that you are aware of or a part of, this is a great thing for you to be putting information out about on right now to those families. A lot of families just, have a lot of things on their minds these days. And so an extra push to remind them to spend that 5 minutes filling out the census could be, a really big difference for your neighborhood and your community over the next 10 years.
That's great. Thanks so much. That's a critical thing to remember. So as you mentioned, we're at a little more than 58% right now in North Carolina for response rates, but we have until October 31st. Now, during that time, the census workers are going to be going door to door, and we recognize that folks don't want to get too close to people during COVID, so we can avoid that by being counted. It's not too late to be counted, and you can be counted right now online or by phone and avoid that personal contact. Absolutely let friends and coworkers and families know. And if you're part of these associations, if you're part of PTA groups, if you're part of online communities, maybe your neighborhood association, just let folks know that it's not too late. And if you'd like to plug in, if you need more resources, Whitney's link to NC Child's website is in the comment section. You can also visit, Whitney mentioned the U.S. Census Bureau site and the NALEO site. Those are also in the comments. And just over my shoulder, you'll see the census.nc.gov. That's the website for the North Carolina Complete Count Commission. You'll find some great resources there that you can download and use, some fact sheets, some economic impact notes on what does the census mean in terms of dollars and cents to my county. You can find that at census.nc.gov. We also have some great I've been counted signs. So if you fill out your census, you can put a sign up in the window of your house, let your friends and neighbors know that you've done your part. We also have them in black and white so your kids can color them in if they need an activity on a hot day when they're stuck in quarantine. Please feel free to use those resources. The information that we've talked about today, it's been a great discussion. Whitney, thanks so much for your time and your expertise. Oh, there is a question that's just come in. How are census workers working with child care workers?
Sure. So this one is highly local, right? So a census worker in your region might be you're doing local promotional work with childcare centers, but overall, what Census Bureau workers are doing is just providing information, right? And so there isn't a coordinated push that is specifically with all childcare providers for a lot of reasons. The top being that a lot of childcare providers closed recently, right, because of COVID-19. And then they've been opening, kind of as they can across the state. And so it's a difficult group to coordinate with. So really, if you want to ensure that the census is promoted, to the families of young children through childcare providers, I'd really encourage you, if you have children in care, to make sure that that information is getting to your childcare provider, because the Census Bureau is, providing information at local sites where they can, but there is a lot less capacity to do that because of COVID-19 and the lack of in-person events, right? And so, you are working with childcare providers, and the Census Bureau is ensuring that you have the information that you need. But if we're talking about just also getting the actual census responses, those come to people's individual households, not to childcare centers, right? So if we want kids to be counted, they get counted at home. And the way to share that information is by using the information that, there are all these different sites that we've given you, including NC Child's. And I'm happy to also answer any direct questions you might have to find something specific. But to make sure that childcare providers have the information to tell parents directly, because the census provider isn't going to show up at the childcare center, they're going to show up at the house. Any other questions? Did that answer your question? Pop in the chat box and let me know if you still have, if I wasn't clear.
Thanks for that, Whitney. We know there's folks are probably going to have other questions, and we know that this question and answer time is going to be loaded on the State Library's YouTube channel with the supporting documents, the slides that you see here with contact information, as well as the links that have come up in the chat box. But if folks have additional questions, you will see the contact information for Whitney and other speakers from the North Carolina Complete Count Commission. So if you have additional questions, please go ahead and send those in, and we'll get back to you through email as soon as we get those. So thanks everyone for your time. Whitney, thank you so much for your expertise today. It's great to see you feeling better. Thanks for being with us.
I'm happy to do it. I'm glad I'm feeling better too. Thank you all for joining.
So not seeing any other questions, we'll wish everyone a great day. Please stay safe. Please be counted on the census, and we will see you at next week's Let's Talk 2020 Census. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.